Hello, everyone. Welcome to another fun episode of Demo Days. Today, I've got a special guest with me, Josh Abernathy. He is a staff software engineer here over at GitHub. And today, we're going to talk about how GitHub uses Codespaces, and in particular, how it has affected our ways of developing software and our engineers. Josh?
Yeah, thank you, AJ. All right, let's dive right in here. So we're talking about Codespaces, and we're talking about, and when we talk about Codespaces, what we're talking about is moving developer environments into the cloud. Um, which, but like, what does that mean, and why should we move developer environments into the cloud? For most of us, we've been doing software engineering for years and years and years, and we've done it all on our laptops or our desktops. So why move it into the cloud? A lot of what I'm going to talk about today is based around our own experience at GitHub. So a few months ago, before Codespaces was released, we undertook this effort to move GitHub's engineering team, specifically the folks who work on GitHub.com, and get them using Codespaces to do their normal day-to-day development work. And through that process, we've learned a lot, and we've been able to make the Codespaces product better as a result. But it's also helped us really appreciate the ways in which this idea of moving developer environments into the cloud has huge potential and is the way that we think development is going to be done in the future, which is a bold claim, but our experiences have shown that there's a lot of potential here. So exactly what does that mean, right? Why do this? What did GitHub learn from this experience of moving engineering into the cloud? There are two big pieces that I'm gonna try to drive home today. And the first is that doing this has lowered the barrier of entry to doing work on GitHub.com. And the second is that it has allowed us to decrease the amount of distraction or busy work or just kind of like unnecessary chores that engineers have to do throughout the course of their day-to-day work. So let's dive into this a little bit more. Lowering the barrier of entry. This one is interesting because I think getting local development environments set up is oftentimes a difficult task, and we often think about this in terms of like new hires or new contributors to a project, right? In order to get productive, they have to actually get the thing working in their development environment, and we experience that with new hires, folks who just join the company, but we also experience it with some other groups of people that we'll talk about in a minute. And within GitHub, we had invested an enormous amount of time and effort into getting this onboarding experience, this startup experience, as smooth as we possibly could. And to a large extent, we succeeded. We had scripts in place that you could run, and you could probably have a development environment working within half a day's time to a couple days, depending on what you ran into. And that was pretty good. We felt pretty good about that, and that it took a lot of effort to get there. But we could do better, and that's one of the things that we learned with Codespaces. So with Codespaces, we can lower the barrier of entry for these new contributors, be they new hires or folks who are just onboarding onto GitHub.com from another team. One of the other interesting things that we discovered within GitHub after doing this work is that it was also a really enabled people who are not in the code day to day, these infrequent contributors, these folks like maybe engineers on other teams, or product designers, product managers, engineering managers, like all of these people who are kind of around the code base, but not working in it every day. Because for them, because they're not working in it every day, the idea of spending half a day or a couple days getting a local development environment running is just absurd, right? Like that's a lot of time that they don't have to make what's probably pretty small change in the first place. But once we adopted Codespaces, what we found was that these folks were some of the very first people to really use Codespaces to do GitHub.com development, because suddenly what was a half a day's work of setup was now a minute's worth of clicking a button, and it's just been hugely enabling for these folks. And so it's kind of opened up this whole other audience by lowering the barrier of entry. We've opened the doors to these folks who otherwise, it would just feel like a bridge too far for them. And then the other group of people that Codespaces really helps out here by lowering the barrier of entry is new software engineers. One of our engineers within the company, John Crepesi, ran a software engineering boot camp for folks who were new to software engineering, maybe coming from other careers or underrepresented backgrounds. And he did it using Codespaces. And this was because when you're just getting started in software engineering, the last thing that you want to do is have to think about how to install the right Rails version or battle with compiling Nokogiri, or all of those things they'll learn in time. Everyone must at some point do battle with Nokogiri, but that shouldn't be a new software engineer's first experience with software, right? Their first experience writing software should be that they are dumped straight into an environment that just works, where they can make a change and then see it reflected in the product. Because that's how for a lot of us, that's where the magic of software engineering is. So that this is one of the big things that we found within GitHub, is that using Codespaces has allowed us to lower the barrier of entry, which has enabled all these different people who may or may not work in the code base every day. And then the second thing that it's allowed us to do is decrease distraction. And that this distraction it comes in a lot of forms, right? There's a lot of technical work that we do as engineers that is not working on the product that we're building. And this can be things like, we clone a new project and install its dependencies, and now my environment's broken. Or it could be, I started working on a feature, and then we changed direction, and now I have this weird feature still stuck in my development environment. All these things, there's all these little things that as software engineers cost us time and take us away from doing really the valuable feature work that we should be doing, that we want to be doing. And so if we can decrease distraction, that's a huge win. And we do that in Codespaces in a couple ways. The first is isolation. And really, both of these points are things that are lessons that, say, the infrastructure world has been learning in the past 10 years around containerization and orchestration. All these principles, these ideas of isolation and reproducibility, these are all things that we've kind of accepted and are the norm now within production systems. We've accepted that our production systems need to be isolated, they need to be reproducible, so that if a pod goes down, it's no big deal. We spin up another pod. We know how to do that. It's all codified within the project itself. And what we're saying is that we can eliminate a lot of distraction and a lot of pain and annoyance by applying these same principles to local development of isolation, of reproducibility. So with isolation, this means that Codespaces are isolated from each other. That means I can, for example, I could start a Codespace that has a dependency on Python 2 and another Codespace that has a dependency on Python 3. And these things aren't going to conflict. For whatever reason, for me, it's always, maybe it's just me in a complicated relationship with Python, but it's always Python 2 and 3 fighting on my machine. But Codespaces isolation fixes this, right? Because it says these two things coexist independently. in isolation. And what happens in this code space doesn't affect this code space. That's great. So isolation, that's one thing. That's one thing that lets us, decrease the distraction of engineering. And the second is reproducibility. And this is this idea that once we have a development environment that works and we've put in that work, we should be able to reproduce that infinitely to any engineer, anyone who wants to contribute to the project. And again, like we tried really hard within GitHub to do this through scripting. But ultimately, people's developer environments, their local machines are just this sea of chaos and dependencies and other software that's running that has a mind of its own. And try as we might, we can't achieve reproducibility in our local development environments. But Codespaces does that, and Codespaces does that by codifying how the development environment for a project should be defined. And we'll take a look at that in a few minutes here. But by taking these principles that, again, are well known and well celebrated already for how we deploy services of isolation and reproducibility, by taking those and applying them to the local development experience, it gives us a lot of power, and it eliminates a lot of busy work. So the combination of these things, right, is if we lower the barrier of entry and we enable all these other people, and at the same time we decrease distraction for the folks who are already doing their work, then the net result of this should be increased productivity. And that's what we've seen, is that within GitHub, by eliminating these whole classes of concerns, we end up with increased productivity. So that's what Codespaces is. Now this is demo days. This isn't Josh talking at people days, which is thankfully not a thing. So, all right, let's get into an actual demo of what Codespaces looks like. Now, unfortunately, I wish, I've been talking about all of this in terms of our experience getting GitHub.com development working in Codespaces. And as lovely as it would be to show you all working in GitHub.com, that is, some people would probably be pretty unhappy with me if I start showing GitHub.com source code. So we're not going to look at GitHub.com. Instead, we are going to look at my Mean Dad repository here. So I am a dad. I have 3 kids, and they have chores. And by merit of me being the dad and giving them chores, it makes me Mean Dad. Having 3 kids also means that I can't keep track of who's done what chore and when, and the days blur together, and I don't remember things. So this is the little web app that lets me keep track of the chores that still need to be done for the day, so I can mark them off. It's not as complicated or as interesting as GitHub.com. Again, I wish I could show it to you, but sadly no. But this is what we're gonna take a look at, what working in a Codespace from this Mean Dad repo looks like. So I could come over here and I could create a new Codespace from my code tab. And this would create a Codespace, then it would drop me into it here in the browser. And that would be just fine. I personally don't enjoy working in the browser, coding in the browser. So instead, I'm going to come over to VS Code, and I can make a new Codespace from within VS Code. So it's Mean Dad. Yes, there's Mean Dad. Your new Codespace from main. And at this point, it's creating a new Codespace. It's cloning the repository down, and then it's getting the whole development environment that we're going to be dropped into defined up to date in the way in which we defined it. We'll take a look at what that means here in a minute. But this is part of that whole reproducibility piece, right? Is that I don't have to do any local setup or configuration to make this work. I just create a Codespace, and by the time my Codespace exists, it's done everything it needs to do. It's ready to roll. And this is, again, super helpful for if other people wanted to contribute on that, if Mean Dad takes off and it becomes the future of chore tracking among mean dads everywhere. But it's also helpful for future me, right? Because I contribute to this infrequently. And when I come along in 3 months and I'm like, gosh, yeah, how does this thing work? I don't have to rely on my memory anymore at that point, right? Because everything is already defined in the repository and it just happens for me. So now we're in the code space. We can see my code over here. I've got my terminal running here. So just so that we can get a feel for like what is mean dad, let's go ahead and run the server. So we'll run dev. You can see down here, it told me, hey, port 3000 is running. Here we see port 3000. If I go over here to my ports tab, it'll also tell me, hey, port 3000 is running. It also tells me that I have Postgres running, which is also handy to know. But for right now, let's just go look at the web app. All right, super simple. All it is chores, right? It's just a list of chores and a button to click. I can click the button done, and now it's marked as done. Make your bed, feed Pippin. That's the dog who's right down there. Set the table. So that's the app that we're going to be working on here in our code space. Now, one thing you might have noticed if you've worked on any node project before is what didn't happen. So we got into this code space and I immediately ran npm run dev. At no point did I run npm install. And that is kind of our first glimpse into this idea that everything, the whole definition of what it takes to run this project is codified and happens automatically so that I don't have to do it. So let's take a look at how this is actually configured. So we have over here this dev container directory. And in this dev container directory, we have a dev container JSON. So let's take a look at that, and I'll collapse some things so we have more room. So this is where we start to configure exactly what our Codespace developer environment looks like. We're going to skip down. We're going to come back to this first Docker compose line in a minute. But we'll skip down and we'll take a look at this first. So we're forwarding our port 3000, which is our server. It's our web app. It's the port that it's running on. We're forwarding those out of our code space so that they're accessible to us. And we're forwarding our Postgres server. And those show up, over here so that we can remember what in the world is running on 5432. It's Postgres. And then here's our post create command. And this is where npm install happened. This means that every time I create a code space, after it's been created, it's going to run npm install for us automatically. And this is why when we first dropped into this code space, I could just run npm run dev without having to do this to begin with. And then lastly, down here, we have this set of extensions, and these are VS Code extensions that are automatically installed when I create the code space. And this, again, is getting to the idea that within this code space, within this repository, we have defined all of the tools, all of the environment that we need to have a successful development environment. And so for this project, that means installing ESLint, and it means installing the Postgres SQL tool. So it means that whoever comes along and wants to work on this automatically has these out of the box. They're already set up to be productive in this environment without us having to do anything else, right? Without them having to install them or without us having to document in the README, hey, look, you're going to have a better time if you install these. It's already done for us. So that's some of the configuration, but we also have this Docker compose file that we're referencing here. And we aren't going to get into the nitty-gritty of Docker compose, but one of the things that our web app needs is we have the node server, but we also need to run Postgres so that we can save the chores and save which ones are done. And one of the ways that we could do that is we could do that by using Docker compose to have both our web and our database running side by side. And then we can tell Codespaces that, hey, the one that I'm going to be working on, the service I'm working on, is the web service. And so we end up having our database standing up without us having to do anything. It just happened for us. And that's super cool. And then lastly, we have over here our Docker file. And this is all just boilerplate right now. But if we wanted to install some additional software here, we could. And again, it would be installed in all of our developer environments. And in fact, let's do that. Let's suppose that the VS Code Postgres extension is super handy, but I'm a command line person, and so I want to be able to just run the command line client for Postgres, but it's not installed. All right, I could manually install it here, but I would rather install it so that everyone who works on this project and any other code spaces I create from this project will have this out of the box. So we can do that by modifying our Docker file. Over here, we're going to say we'll install PostgreSQL client. Saved our Docker file. And now VS Code has noticed that this Docker file that is kind of the basis for this container that we're in right now, has changed. So it wants to rebuild it. And we're going to go ahead and do that. We're going to take that suggestion. So I didn't talk about this when we were first creating the Codespace, but what's really happening here with Codespaces is that we're creating a Docker container. We're defining a Docker container that is our entire development environment. And so when I modify that Docker file to install Postgres client, it means that whenever I create a Codespace, the container that it's going to end up dropping us into to do development is that container. And so all of the kind of knowledge that you already have from working with Docker files and containerization, all of that still applies here. And we can use those familiar tools like Docker Compose, like we already saw. We can use those things. All of that knowledge just transfers right in. Now, while I was talking, we missed it there, but you can see right here is where our Postgres client is getting installed. So it's going to continue to pull all of our images. Now it's standing up our Docker Compose. And now it's putting us back into our development container. And once we're in here, we should be able to then run our PSQL command and actually connect to Postgres. So let's give it a shot. Fingers crossed, live demos for me. We are going to connect to localhost. We're going to connect to, what was that port again? 5432. Our user is admin, our databases work. And there we go. PSQL is now installed. And again, it's not just, assuming I commit and push this, it's not just installed in this Codespace. It's going to be available in every Codespace that I spin up for this project. And so it gives me an incredible amount of leverage for anyone else who's going to work on this thing with me and for my future self. It's always nice to be kind to my future self. All right, now let's make a change in our app. Suppose that, let's get our app running again. npm dev. And we'll just go make sure it looks good. Yep, looks good. All right, one of the things you'll note here is that we have these two make your bed entries, and that's because there's two different kids who really have this chore. And actually, these two other chores are assigned to other kids. So we want to show what the kid's name is who's supposed to be doing this thing. We already have this in our SQL. You can see we have a person here in our chores table, and it's already assigned here. These aren't the names of my kids. We'll protect them. Is the name of my dog. We don't care about protecting him. So that field was what, person? So we'll come over here and we'll just throw chore assignee's name here. And there's our change. Now we can use assign to all these things, and that's great. That's lovely. They will love that. Now let's suppose that that I want to show this change. You know, I'm gonna make Mean Dad go big. I need to get some funding. It's going to be the next big thing. Right now, I'm visiting it on localhost port 3000. But actually, I could share this. I could go over here to my ports tab, and I could say, on my web port here, port 3000, I could say, make this port public. And what you'll notice is that our address has changed. It's now this GitHub preview URL. And if I visit that, we should see the same thing. Oh no. Well, demos, live demos. Refresh it and it's fine. It's software. What are you gonna do? But now we have this URL that is publicly accessible. This is publicly reachable, and those of you who are maybe faster or who are fast can grab that and go mark some chores done. I'm sure my kids won't mind. But now I could share this URL, right? And for Mean Dad, that is handy. But we found this to be really useful within GitHub itself, because this means that working on github.com, we can share changes with each other, with other engineers, but also with, again, designers, product managers, all these folks who are kind of around the project. We can send these URLs to them, and we can verify, hey, does this do what you wanted it to do? Does this behave how you think? What do you think of the design, the interaction? Do you find any bugs? And this is just something I can do with a single click within a Codespace. This doesn't require any other dependencies. I don't need to deploy it to Azure or set up Nginx or anything, or Ngrok or anything like that. And this is, again, a great example of the ways in which Codespaces can kind of eliminate these little distractions that we would otherwise experience. The whole question of I want to show this to someone. With Codespaces, you just make it public and you send them a URL. So that is a brief overview of Codespaces, of what the experience of using Codespaces looks like, the ways in which it allows us to define our development environment, change our development environment, make changes to the product that we're working on, and then share those changes with other people. Let me switch back over here. And that is the end of my demo. Hopefully we've shown today the ways that Codespaces, this idea of putting developer environments into the cloud is immensely valuable and gives us a lot of power to make our development environments more productive for all of us, and enables whole new classes of people to do development. Thank you very much. If there's any questions, or I'd be happy to talk more to anything in particular. Well, thank you all very much for your patience and your attention. I hope this has been helpful. We have lots of documentation on github.com around Codespaces and all the different ways that you can set it up, configure your environment. And I hope that it is productive and helpful to you and makes you a more productive engineer. Thank you very much.